keep eating, but I'm going to make a few very short announcements. If you want more cake, please go outside and help yourselves. If you want to review anything of what David discussed in his talk, this entire program, by the way, is archived at the event website, which is mediaethics.jmc.kent.edu. Also, David Folkenflik will be speaking tonight at the Akron Summit County Public Library, sponsored by NPR station WKSU. Andrew, yeah. This free event starts at 7 p.m. I recommend leaving plenty of time to navigate downtown, because I went downtown and then I couldn't, and I used to work downtown and I could not get to the library, although today I'm told that now you can get to the library. So just saying, David will be at the Akron Summit County Public Library tonight at 7 o'clock. His talk tonight is titled Breaking News and Broken News, Media in the Age of Trump. Here are two other small notes. Please remember to fill out the green evaluation forms, which are either in your packet or on the table outside. We use these every year to figure out what you liked, what you didn't like, what you'd rather have for dinner or lunch, you know, how the audio, yeah, really, more cake, I know, right? This is our first time, Tommaso. We've never had cake before, yeah. We might have more cake. But we do use these to see what you liked and to see, you know, to get your ideas for concepts for the next year's workshop. So please, please, please fill this out and then leave it either with me or on the desk outside. And then next, I want to remind all of you in Kent that our next ethics program is called Media at the Movies. It'll be Tuesday, March 6th. This year, we're going to screen the movie Nightcrawler. And we'll have a panel discussion about ethics afterward. This is free, it's open to the public, and no cake, but popcorn. So it works out great. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Indira, who is going to moderate our next discussion, which I have termed in my own way, literacy, meaning how do we do this? So this will be a very practical discussion of news literacy, media literacy, and photo and visual literacy. Indira.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, Jen. And for everyone here who has been asking the great questions about how do I become more news literate, what do I do about my crazy aunt and uncle who, you know, retweet fake news or rather Facebook it or whatever, I think this is going to be a really interesting session for you. We have three fantastic experts here who each have taken the time to put together a presentation to share some of their best tips for how to be smart about news and how to help others you know be smart about news. So first we have Damaso Reyes, who's the program manager for the News Literacy Project. For those of you who aren't familiar with the News Literacy Project, I commend you to look it up. It's a nonprofit that is dedicated to educating kids about news literacy. He'll tell you more about it. And he was a photojournalism student at NYU and did multimedia work as a journalist and has been published in all sorts of publications, including the New York Times and the AP. And next to Damaso is Alicia Calzada, who has a very interesting background, having spent many years as a photojournalist and serving in the National Press Photographers Association in the ethics committee and actually helping them put together a lot of the material they have, specifically on ethics. And she sort of crossed over and decided she became so interested in legal issues that she herself became an attorney. So she's now a lawyer who works on First Amendment issues and legal issues affecting photojournalists, and she's taught at Texas State as well. And next to her is Kendra Albright, who is here at Kent State. Many of you may know her as the director of the Library and Information Science program, and she has done leadership in library science for many, many years, a woman after my heart because my own mother is an academic librarian or was retired. And so Kendra is active in associations including IFLA, which is the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. Weird trivia fact, I happen to know they had their meeting in Wrocław, Poland this year and got reports from various of my mom's friends who were there. So I'm going to let each of them give their presentations, and I'm going to sort of step into the audience so I can watch them because I think I have a lot to learn too. So take it away, Damaso, first, please.
Thank you for having me. This is my first time in Kent State, only my second time in Ohio, so maybe I fall into that category of coastal journalists who don't get to see the rest of the country enough, although in my defense, I will say I spent most of my adult life outside America, so I have a little bit of an excuse. As was mentioned, I work with the News Literacy Project. We are a nonprofit, and we work specifically to help educators give middle school and high school students the tools they need to help understand the difference between fact and fiction. And as we've heard earlier today, that's an increasingly difficult thing to do, so please follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. I'm going to sort of breeze through a bunch of examples of the challenging landscape that our young people, as well as our friends and neighbors and ourselves face. Here's a picture that went viral on social media recently, and this is something that got spread on Twitter. This photograph here, and with the last president, there was a lot of discussion of how much golf he played. With this president, there's a lot of discussion of how much golf he played. And this photograph, this tweet got picked up, and so people started commenting on it. And the belief was that, obviously, this is a photograph of the president playing golf. So you have all these folks responding to this image, and it's not a real image. This is actually a manipulated photograph. It's originally taken from a photograph of the golfer John Daly. But if you're predisposed to criticize President Trump, you might see this photoshopped image and let your predisposition then move you to share this image or comment on this image. And this is something that we see a lot of on social media. All right, here we go. So here's another picture that went viral during the G7 summit. So here's a photograph of leaders, and people picked up on this and spread it like wildfire. Turns out, not so much. So you can have a little bit of fun. You can have Putin jump in and out of the picture. But it's not a real image. This is obviously, it was an image of an empty seat, and leaders were talking to each other, and then someone cleverly put in President Putin. It looks like we have a little bit of a lag here. There we go. So obviously, maybe seeing was never believing, but certainly in the 21st century, seeing is definitely not believing. You might remember this photo. Originally, it was a photo that the First Lady took holding a piece of paper saying, with the hashtag Bring Our Girls Back, talking about the girls who had been abducted in West Africa. But it's very easy if someone's holding a sign or a blank piece of paper to change that. And depending on your perspective, you're going to believe it. So this is actually a still taken from a video. So you see it in still photographs, but the technology is sufficient that you can also manipulate video. So here's a still from a video of someone claiming to have held up this sign behind Prime Minister May during the UK vote. That did not happen. That was not real. This photo kind of went viral last year. It's of Tom Hanks wearing this T-shirt. Not real. This is the original photo of him supporting a soccer team, or football team, as they say in the rest of the world. And someone, photoshopped him in. So you can Photoshop him with any message you want. And what's interesting is that this shirt then becomes, if you type in Tom Hanks T-shirt or Tom Hanks shirt on Google, this is the shirt that pops up. So we have this cycle that ends up happening within. People have the ability to create fake tweets. So here's a purported tweet. It says Donald J. Trump, real Donald Trump, has the blue check mark next to it. And, it says giving Canada their independence was one of the biggest mistakes America ever made. he promises to make Canada America again. Not true. You can go on a website and create your very own fake Trump tweet. You can do it for basically anyone on the internet. So it's very, very easy to do this. It's maybe shockingly easy to some of the people in the room. Here is a very short list and not conclusive lists of fake news sites or sites. And so this is three pages. This is obviously not comprehensive, but it gives you some idea of the landscape that we're facing. So at the News Literacy Project, we really see the challenge, much I think as you guys do, is being very large, but we also feel that there is a solution. And that solution really is about education. I was talking with some of my fellow panelists and some of the other people at the conferences. They were asking me, well, how do you reach the aunt or the uncle or the grandparent who shares things? And that's a very challenging lift. We're focused on young people, right? We're focused on secondary school students, partially because we feel like news literacy and media literacy education is something that needs to happen over time. It's really hard to get to adults because you don't have them for the long stretches of time. You don't get to necessarily reinforce skill, although this is, reaching adults is something that we are working to do. We've had a PSA partnership with Facebook to try to reach folks who are older. But what we've seen in the 9 years that we've existed as an organization is that young people who go through our program and go through news literacy and media literacy training, their behaviors change, their attitudes change. They're more likely to do things like vote when they're old enough, or write a letter to the editor, or correct an error that they see in the media. They're also more likely to seek out legitimate sources of information. So the challenge is large, but it's not insurmountable. You can teach young people, you can also teach adults the skills that they need to be able to discern credible information from non-credible information. But I think one of the things that we all have to acknowledge is that it is a skill that needs to be taught. You're not going to learn how to tell the difference between fake news and real news or misinformation from credible information by osmosis. And sometimes I think that we think, well, it should be common sense. People should know better. But the truth is the media landscape has changed so dramatically over the last 10 and 20 years that as a society, we haven't caught up with that. We haven't developed social mores around this new technology. Facebook is only 10 years old. Twitter is even less old than that. So we as a society still have to figure out how we interpret this sort of information, but we also have to teach skills to deal with the new media landscape that exists. So at that, I'm going to pass it on to.
Thanks. Well, I'd like to talk also a little bit about what we as journalists and the journalism industry can do about the problem, because that's the audience I have, and that's sort of the folks that I work with, and that's sort of what we can do. We can't necessarily reach everyone who's misinterpreting messages and listening to fake news, but we can do our part. And believe me when I say we have really important role in this problem and solving this problem and preventing it from getting even worse. And one of the important things to think about when you deal with a problem is the root cause. My father was a root cause analyst in the nuclear power industry, so it was a fantastic work that he did. He didn't just say, well, there was a shutdown of this power plant, but, and why did it initially happen, but, why did that happen, and why did that happen, and what were all the things that led to it. And root cause analysis is a really useful tool for approaching problems. One of the things that these fake images do, and I'm talking primarily about images because I'm a specialist in photography, and I was the president of the National Press Photographers Association, and that's the group that I work with and try to help. But they usually advance someone's agenda. So you have to think about why someone is advancing their agenda and be prepared for the fact that people have agendas and they're trying to pursue them. As journalists, it's our job to not have an agenda, to seek to be as agenda-free as possible, but our sources have agendas, and if we just sort of regurgitate things that are fed to us, we have to keep in mind that the people feeding that to us have an agenda. Another reason that these things happen and get credence and go places and grow legs is because they show us what we want to see. So some people wanted to believe that Hillary Clinton had, had this secret life in the pizza parlor. And so, those people heard what they wanted to hear, and they went with it. And the same thing is true in many other ways. And so be aware of things, and I think this has been touched on several times, to be aware of things that feed into your biases and make you say, yeah, I knew that all along. Because there's people out there who are basically saying, let me see what you want to see, and I'm going to show it to you, whether it's real or not. These things happen more when we don't invest in journalism, okay? Journalism is facing a huge problem now because we are reducing the size of our newsrooms, and that reduction often comes in the people who are the gatekeepers who prevent this stuff from happening. And I'm going to show some examples and talk about how they were prevented or caught by gatekeepers. But it also happens because we don't invest in journalists who are producing good journalism, and instead we're saying, well, we can't afford to hire people, so we're going to take free content if we can, and anyone who wants to give us free content, we'll take it and we'll publish it. But nothing is free. You're getting something for free because somebody has an agenda. And giving this to you to republish and show to the world advances their agenda. So what is that agenda? Well, maybe it's not nefarious, but maybe it is. Maybe it's to promote their company or to promote their message. And so you have to think about, what that agenda is and prepare yourself for not being manipulated and pursuing somebody else's agenda, because that's not your job as a journalist. Your job as a journalist is to report and to observe. And, so as an industry, we also have to give our journalists those tools, and we also have to fund it. And it happens when journalists along the chain of command are not trained. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of process of, what happens with a photograph. And, each part along the way, something can go wrong. And if there's not training along the way, that picture can be manipulated, that work can be manipulated. I worked once, and I'm not going to call anybody out, but I did work once with a publication where a designer inserted a baseball in a photograph I had taken. And it was because that person who had done that, and it got published, but that person had not had the same kind of journalism ethics training that we have here. And so, if you use people who aren't trained in our standards, then of course they're not going to meet our standards. And again, that comes with investing in journalism. So this is an example of this was a fairly long time ago, but it was, I think this was Lebanon. It was just a bombing. But for some reason, the photographer decided that, I'll scroll back a little, this was the original picture. For some reason, they didn't like the smoke, so they just kind of cloned some darker, more ominous-looking smoke. Why did the photographer do that? I don't know. Nobody really knows, but perhaps it advanced their agenda of trying to make this scene look more ominous. Perhaps they thought it would make a better picture. Obviously, they had no Photoshop skills at all. But it went out on the wire, and that led to this picture kill. Now, at the time, the agency had reduced their sort of mid-level editing staff internationally. And some people suggested that if that hadn't happened, that this would have been caught further along the way. And that's what I mean when I talk about gatekeepers. You have people that are there to spot this stuff, and really, any good photo editor who looked at this should probably say, wait a second. You know, these guys look at thousands and thousands and thousands of images all day long, but they're very sharp, and they know how to spot things. But when you don't have them there, when you just have people directly uploading, and of course that's what Facebook and Twitter and other social media, Instagram do, you know, you just have people directly uploading stuff, you have nobody that says, this is accurate, this is appropriate, this is you know, what we need to communicate to the world. So it's a gatekeeper problem in part, even though some people would blame the photographer. You have to think about the root causes. This was another example of a news photographer. I hope you can see it. There's the photo on the left and the photo on the right. They decided that neither of those was dramatic enough, and so they were combined to make the photo at the bottom, which was published and ran out, shared on the news wires. A photo editor figured this out. I think if you look at the bottom of the, below the soldier, you'll see some parts of the photograph that actually are replicated, and that's how the photo editor spotted it. But a photo editor caught this and prevented it from being further distributed. Then you sometimes along the way will have people who are in the newsroom, and maybe they have an agenda and they want to advance it, and so they'll manipulate a photograph to fit their message. This is the same photo, but you see how it ran differently in those two different publications. So that's, you know, changing the tone and the color of a photograph is considered an unethical manipulation by the National Press Photographers Association. And people have been fired for overtoning their photographs because that's not journalism, you know. So, and magazine covers are kind of a whole nother beast that I could spend a whole hour talking about, but I won't. Again, you know, somebody thought, well, this would be better if it didn't have the leg in the background. But, you know, for photographers, it's the equivalent of saying, of misquoting or, you know, making up a quote. You know, if you make up a photograph, if you put something in a photograph that isn't there, it's false. So that's where we come down on it. Now, 2017 is a different media landscape. You know, we've got a lot of this social media stuff. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of examples where this has come to root in modern day. This photograph on the right was circulated on social media as an example of an Antifa protester who was beating a policeman. You can see on the left, it's really just a stock photo from Getty Images of a riot from many, many years ago. And so it really had...
I believe it's from Greece.
Yeah, it was from Greece.
It's not even the same country.
Right. So that's one thing you'll see people do these days is take a photo that was true when it was shown and alter it in a minor way, or just, you know, completely put a photograph that was not, you know, tell you a photograph was taken in Miami and it was really in Mexico City or something like that. And I think that I have one of those examples later. But so people will tell you a photograph is one thing when it's really another thing. This is an example of what happens when you get your pictures for free from the government, okay? My friend Bob Owen was on the picture desk at the San Antonio Express News, and he was going through, some soldiers had passed away, and he was going through the wire photos, and saw this photo of one of them, and then this photo of the next one. What do you notice? It's the same photo, right? They just pasted their faces in and changed the little name tag underneath. And this led to a deeper conversation with the Department of Defense about making sure that if they're going to give us handout photos, they give us real photos. But this is an example of what happens. There were several failures here in the sense that this got on the wire, and one of them being that the news media is accepting photos from the government instead of getting them themselves. And in a situation like this, you may not have a choice, right? Because this is a soldier who's passed away, but eventually you're going to go to the family and get your own photos or duplicate photos. But that was part of the problem. Another part of the problem was there was probably somebody in the Department of Defense who had no temperature of journalism ethics that was doing this and probably didn't even realize that this was, a big no-no. This is something really interesting that happened recently. There was this Instagram profile of this guy his name was Eduardo Martins, and he was supposedly a photographer for the United Nations, and he had this storied history, and he was a handsome surfer and traveled the world and had all kinds of conflict photography, and he was offering it for free again. So, this is the thing that always sets my spidey senses off is when things are free. Come to find out, it was a complete fabrication. Like, his backstory was fictional. The picture of him was actually somebody else's picture. He'd assumed his physical identity, and he distributed all these pictures. They were other people's pictures, and he'd offered them to news agencies. You can see some of them are just flipped, but they're the same pictures. So he'd taken other people's photos and said, "Oh, these are my pictures. I took these pictures. Go ahead. You may use them." So some people did get snagged in this. And again, I would say, he was telling us what we wanted to hear, and he had a lovely backstory. I think he was even presented as himself as a cancer survivor, which made him even more adorable. And, so you want to love somebody who does great work, and you don't think about it. And in this disconnected world, maybe you don't even have a chance to say, wait a second, I've never met you, I've never spoken to you. So I don't really know what his agenda is. Nobody knows. The profile just disappeared, and he has vanished into anonymity. But it's something to think about, that there are people out there who are completely non-existent people posing as journalists, and that I find incredibly frightening. This is an example of a picture somebody said was Miami, I think, but it was really an old photo from Mexico City, I believe. And this was tweeted out by the White House social media director, So people are showing us what we think we want to hear. We wanted to see devastation in Florida, so we got it. The eclipse, by the end of the day, you were probably inundated with beautiful pictures from the eclipse, and so everyone wanted a more beautiful picture. So what could be more beautiful than the eclipse setting over the ocean? Well, it wasn't there, right? But somebody made this beautiful photo, and it got circulated, and so people did it. I don't think it ran in any news publications, but nevertheless,
it's definitely on social media.
Yeah, it was out there, and people just loved it, and. This is an example of a social media post that fit someone's agenda. It's been really trendy to beat on the Red Cross lately. So here, somebody tweeted this photo or Facebooked it, and it fit the agenda, and so it spread. It fit what people wanted to say.
What is that?
It's a lunch plate, and it was allegedly what the Red Cross was handing out to hurricane victims. It was not accurate. I don't know where it came from, but this is real. It was not real. So people repurpose old photos to tell a new story that isn't necessarily true. Sometimes it's ego seekers. And like I said, they tell you what you want to hear. And we want free. We want something for nothing. And if you don't pay for journalism, and that includes subscribing, supporting your radio stations, and subscribing to your newspapers, and, if you don't invest in the journalism you consume, then you have to wonder what you're getting for nothing, right?
How many times as a photographer have you been asked by a publication to let them publish your photographs without paying you? Because I know as a freelance photographer, it happened
Plenty.
dozens of times, which I
Yeah.
found both strange and kind of reprehensible. Say, well, we don't have a budget for this photo.
Yeah, I mean, to me, you have a budgeting problem, that's not my problem if you don't have a budget. But absolutely, it does happen, and I will say that, as somebody who does advocate on behalf of journalists, I also do writing that I often don't get compensated for. That writing is not me being a reporter. That writing is me being an advocate.
Right.
And, it's something to consider. One thing you really need to do when you're consuming is consider the source. A reliable news outlet is more quick to respond when a fake image is caught. And when you're on social media, you just, you can't trust what you see. So you really want to find trustworthy sources. If you suspect something, then you can turn to a trustworthy source. Like, if something allegedly happens in Denver, let's go to Denver and see, And then licensing the work from a reputable source. Don't just get this guy off Instagram to send you free pictures and assume it's correct.
Don't copy photos from the internet and publish them
Not
on your
license them.
website. I've
Right.
had that happen to my photographs.
Yeah,
People have just copied and pasted my images and
yeah,
then published them alongside an article
right.
without ever contacting me.
Indira?
No, I just want to, I'll give you a chance to wrap up so we can get to
sure.
Kendra, and
Yeah,
then we
let's do
can
it.
continue the discussion, because I want to make sure we have time for questions as well. And I have questions for all of you, so,
Okay.
yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. So the main thing I wanted to just catch in here was the stream of commerce. The very basic structure stream of commerce of photos is you have a photographer, someone who chooses the picture, somebody who publishes the picture, and maybe somebody who republishes it. But everywhere along that stream, there's a potential for manipulation, and that's something really important to
Okay,
consider.
good. When we come back through and
Yeah.
do questions, I'm going to ask you to give people some practical tips. Kendra, why don't you give us a quick overview, and then we can begin our four-way discussion.
Okay, so psychoanalysis 101.
And you're going to be dealing more with information, the
I
information,
am.
not just news stories and
Not
photos,
news at
but
all.
information.
So I come from the School of Information. My PhD's in communications, but I concentrated in information sciences, and I have a Master of Science in Library Science from the old days of library science. But most of my research has been in information science, really trying to understand and peel back some of the ways of why information affects behavior, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that. So first of all, I just want to say thank you for including me on such an esteemed panel. This is just an amazing thing. I got a chance to talk with these two last night, and I learned so much. And I wish we had a lot more time because they have some great stories. So I hope that what I'm going to say will actually wrap around some of what they've been doing. And I've been giving this a lot of thought. Libraries, when you guys think about libraries, you think about a mission of people who collect materials that are to create an informed citizenry, which is very common and similar to the mission of journalism. And so a lot of what I'm going to say about evaluating information is really going to overlap a lot with what they've talked about already. I have a handout here that has tips for evaluating information resources, and I'll make those available. And those dovetail almost exactly with what Alicia was saying at the end. Don't hand those out just yet. Just yet. Thank you. All right. But rather than focus on those kinds of tips and tricks, because those are easy to just hand those out to you, I really wanted to peel back these layers and talk a little bit more. So I really want to talk about the relationship between information and human behavior, which focuses in our field on information needs, what we need to know that we may not even know that we need to know, how we then go look for it once we know what we're looking for, and then how we use it. And how we use it is what I'm really interested in, is how we use it and how do we evaluate the sources and the information itself of what we use. So I hope that ties in here. Just a little bit of background from information science. We have 3 paradigms in our field. One started with the black box. 1950s, we had, computers and bugs in the computer and that sort of stuff. So we were really interested in the hardware and software. And then around the late 70s, we really started focusing on the users, looking at the cognitive processes that go on in the users. And then in about the last 10 years, we've really been focusing on emotional aspects, how emotion plays a role in this. So what I want to talk about here is that there are complex emotional and cognitive issues that purportedly exist outside of our levels of conscious awareness that affect the ways that we would absorb information, the way we use information. And so the problem is that we have assumed for many years that users are rational beings. And in reality, we all know that we have certain knee-jerk reactions that go way back to our early childhoods, what we were taught by our parents. Isn't this correct to say that a lot of people vote the way their parents voted? I think I've read that somewhere, and that's really your area of expertise. But a lot of our mental life, those thoughts and feelings, motives, drives, wishes, desires, values, etc., really live outside of conscious awareness. And Drew Weston, who wrote a wonderful book called The Political Brain, I don't know how many of you have read that, said that about up to 90% of our decision-making is made at the unconscious level. So we're not even aware that we're making decisions all the time. And cognitive theories really don't help us address the role of the unconscious in these decisions, and that's where psychodynamic theories can really help. So let me give you a little perspective here. So the cognitive perspective is really concerned with how information is received from our senses. It's processed by the brain and how this processing directs how we behave. And a lot of neuroscience kind of was born out of wanting to look for cognitive processes that deal with memory and perception, thinking, and language. It's based on, again, rational thinking. And it really considers emotion to be something that's just part of that information processing, and it doesn't really take into account the way that it affects us at a deeper level. Psychodynamic perspectives, however, includes affective and cognitive processes or motivational processes that operate in parallel, that we can have conflicting feelings. I don't know how many of you guys say, well, I feel 2 ways about that. That's allowed in this perspective. And it motivates people to act in opposing ways, which sometimes forces us to lead to just a dichotomy of perspectives of our own, and then we have to resolve those. It also says that stable personality patterns begin in childhood, which deals a lot with what Damaso just touched on. The educational programs at the News Literacy Project, is that the right name for it? Are very much focused on children and young people, and that's a really important thing that, according to psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theory, that's where we need to get to these people to help them develop and integrate those kinds of processes early in childhood. So personality development involves learning to really understand ourselves, others, and the relationships that guide our interactions. So just a little bit of features about psychodynamic theory is that they're focused on affect and the expression of emotion, that we really try hard to avoid anything that's distressing in terms of thoughts and feelings. I'm going to talk about that again in a minute. We have also recurring themes and patterns of which we may or may not be aware. Our past experiences relate to present experiences. That's the childhood thing. Childhood experiences are important, and 90% of a child's brain is developed by the time they're age 5. And personality really begins to stabilize in those early years. And our interpersonal relationships are very important, and they focus on why and how those relationships occur. And it also doesn't want to see constraints on speech. And that interpersonal relationships is really interesting. I have a girlfriend who works to make phone calls for the Democratic Party during political years and elections. And she told me of this pattern she had identified, that when she called a household that was Republican and she got a woman on the phone, she said that the Republican wives, when she asked them who they were going to vote for, they'd say, "Can you hold on, please?" And they'd go, "Honey, who are we going to vote for?" So that was just her observation as an experience as a telephone caller. So this psychodynamic theory of decision-making is really looking at the role of the unconscious versus the conscious. And there's a separate theme that Drew Weston has also built into this, which says that the greater the emotional salience of an issue, of something that's tough to deal with emotionally, the more likely that decision is going to be made outside of conscious awareness. So it's very important that we protect that soft underbelly of our own values, our beliefs, and our emotions, to do what I consider, and I picked this up from you guys, to protect that confirmation bias, which is that tendency to believe only those things that confirm our own pre-existing beliefs. And we do this through the use of defense mechanisms. I'm not going to go into all of these, but certainly you could recognize some of these. For example, intellectualization, which in an academic environment, I imagine a lot of you are very practiced at this. If something's very difficult to swallow, it's really easy to overanalyze it and intellectualize it, when sometimes maybe what we all, I know I'm very guilty of this, need to step back and go, now why do I really feel that way? So what I wanted to do is just to offer you another alternative for how to deal with this. Something we don't talk about very often, and this is something that I've used in my own research. This has to do with not only evaluating sources, it's about evaluating any kind of information, which is to use projective tests. And that means that we can have people tell us a story. I think you were talking about some of the exercises you do with the children, where they're doing writing. I know I saw where you were working with child soldiers, or talking about some research on that. And the child soldiers, one of the things that's been done with those from the Uganda who were affected by the Lord's Resistance Army was to get involved in acting. There was an actress, and I'm sorry, I can't remember her name right now, but she was on the West Wing, and she started up this acting troupe that went to Uganda to use that acting as an opportunity to reintegrate those child soldiers back into their communities. So telling pictures and stories, using expressive techniques, just talking about those first things that come to mind. I did a study recently using subliminal messaging, which I know has been used in advertising many years ago, but it's also been used in psychology. And we used it to understand how people search for information using Google, and found that indeed our hypotheses were supported, that when we emitted a subliminal emotional message, that the people who were looking for difficult topics, when we emitted that emotional message of reassurance, they would be much more likely to keep searching for information. So we had some real valid results there. It was just a very preliminary pilot study, but we were able to do that. So, and just to wrap it up, I just wanted to tell you, this is a project that we did to have young men who were incarcerated in the South Carolina Juvenile Justice Department for some very serious crimes, wrote a book about AIDS prevention for African American teens in South Carolina. It was picked up by we got interviewed by the New York Times. USA Today ran our video, picked up our video. But anyway, it's all about a story that was written about sports and AIDS prevention. It was written by these young men who, in the process of writing the book, learned a lot of information, and by inserting themselves into these stories, we learned a lot about their own troubles with HIV/AIDS. So this was cathartic for them, and when we tested it with groups around the country, we found that this was the most effective way to translate information from the target population, by the target population, for the target population. And so we've had several articles around that, and I told you last night, we were talking about this at the table, information vaccine. That information, the way to deal with some of the fake news is if you teach children when they're young that this is a vaccine that we can do through prevention of false information, and that's really important. I just wanted to end with a story. I once met with a criminal court judge in Tennessee named Buddy Scott, who was retiring, and he said he had seen, the same 2% of the population committing 98% of the crime as a young man, and then when he got to be a middle-aged man, he saw their grandsons doing the same, that same 2% of the families committing 98% of the crime. And that as a retiring man, he saw their grandsons, and they were all male, and that they tended to be the same families over and over, that they were passing this down, and that we really needed to intervene earlier than he thought than elementary school. So preschools are looking at that. That's one of my background areas, was in child and family studies, including child development, looking at the ways in which we can get in with children early to help curtail some of the values that they're not getting that are helpful to them to have healthy development from their own homes. So it
Thank
ties
you.
in really well with them. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Okay, well, Kendra has just given us a great sort of 100,000-foot view, I'd say, a sort of a backdrop of understanding psychologically why we may have a propensity to believe fake news. I'd like to, in our discussion, sort of focus on some more practical tips that people can take with them and use with them. So let me ask you, Damaso, you know, not all of us can, well, none of us, of course, is in the 6th through 12th grade, so we don't qualify for being in the News Literacy Project programs. But tell me, what are some of the top-line things, the sort of takeaways that you can give us to do with our own families at home or our own colleagues? What are the things, what are some simple techniques we can do to check information when we see something that confirms our bias and we want to click it, or we see something that shocks us and we think that can't be true? How can we check it out and be sure?
Well, I think what we teach our young people through our Checkology platform, and by the way, you don't have to, you may not be a secondary school student, but you may be the parent of a secondary school student. So make their teachers and schools aware that there are these resources out there. But I think the first thing that we teach our young people is to recognize that you're having a feeling, right? So if you come across something on social media and it makes you angry or it makes you feel strongly, then odds are you're being manipulated. And so if you're being manipulated, then you get to ask the question, well, why am I being manipulated? Why do I feel angry when I see this? Why does this so, conform with what I already think about the president or what I already think about, this Hollywood star or fill in the blank? So I think we have to get into a mode of being more questioning of what we see online. That's the very first step, because once we start questioning the information, then we're not taking it at face value. And the people who create misinformation, create these memes, what they're hoping to do is invoke strong emotions in us to circuit our ability to reason. And so they don't want us to analyze, they don't want us to question, they just want us to hit share. Because we're so angry, or we're so upset, or we find this so funny. Sometimes it's masked in humor, as we've seen before. So I think the very first thing that we can do is really ask ourselves, why are, if we have a strong emotional response, why are we feeling this way? What about this information is provoking this response? And then maybe start asking ourselves, well, is this actually real, or is this trying to manipulate me?
So tell us, what's the biggest hurdle that you find in teaching news literacy? Where does the resistance come up? And maybe you don't get resistance from kids, but tell us about the resistance you get from adults, and what do you do to overcome that?
I think that, a lot of adults kind of somewhat understand the issues, so they kind of feel like, well, everyone should. Some of this should be, the phrase I've heard a lot is common sense. Well, children, young people aren't going to understand news and information literacy by osmosis. They actually do have to be taught it. And I think that a lot of I wouldn't necessarily call it resistance, but I think there's a lot of inertia. Superintendents, creators of curriculum, teachers, they've developed their curriculum over years. They have a pattern. They know they know how to teach what they know how to teach. And for some folks, when you're dealing with a topic where you don't have any expertise in, like say news literacy, you can struggle. How do I create a resource for my students? How do I take on this challenge when maybe I, as an educator, don't fully understand it? So when we come to them and say, hey, we have a free resource, and they kind of get excited, but then it's like, well, how do I integrate it into my lesson plan? I've got this wonderful lesson plan I've developed over 10 years. Now I have to find another place for it. And as we've become a society which has been more focused on testing, a lot of teachers don't have a lot of space in their curriculum to do things other than prepare for tests. So that's some of what we're seeing on the landscape. But since we've launched our Checkology virtual classroom in May of 2016, we've gone from basically zero to having over 7,000 teachers who are registered to use our platform, with a potential reach of over 1 million students. And that's just in a little over a year in all 50 states and over 60 countries around the world. So we see that there's a tremendous appetite. for news literacy instruction, but just as things like Facebook and Twitter are new, teaching news literacy is part of sort of a core educational requirement is also something that's very new. So teachers and educators and parents are also adapting to this new reality and having some challenges with it.
All right. Alicia, I want to ask you just a very basic question. Let's say I'm on the internet and I see the shark photo and I think, oh my God, the shark is in Houston in the floodwaters. How can I, as an individual consumer of information and news, how can I check that photo and see whether that's true?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of very basic tools. I don't know if any of you have ever used Google image search. It's a great tool for photographers who are looking for people who've used their pictures, but it's also a great tool for consumers of pictures. You can drop a picture in there, and it will pull up a bunch of previous uses of the picture on the internet. And so if you see a picture from 2017 that claims to be from something, and you drop it in there, and maybe you'll see citations to it from 10 years ago. Well, that'll tell you that now you're probably not going to find that shark picture. It appears in all kinds of different places, and so the exact iteration of it may be different. But a good place also to look for stuff like that, and I use this all the time, is Snopes.com. Snopes.com or Snopes. Is it
You mean
Snopes?
Snope? The fact-checking website?
Yes. Yes.
Snopes.
Snopes.
Uh-huh.
And actually, I have a photo in my PowerPoint that I got from there. They actually have a whole section on fake pictures in Snopes.com. And it's just a great place. If anything looks questionable, and really before I republish anything, I typically go there unless I am terribly confident of the source.
So, some of this is stuff that, if we recognize things, like, for example, there was a photo that was circulated that was showing Black Lives Matters protesters, and it purported that these were BLM protesters blocking the highway in Houston during the flood. And I looked at the picture and I thought, well, first of all, there's snow on the side of the highway there. That's a little weird. That
Wasn't
doesn't.
that picture in Ohio?
I think it was in Ohio, in fact. You're right. And it was a red brick building, and someone found the original photo, and they had partly it was like there was it was the name of a company that's a very popular, I think, Cincinnati company that is anyway, it was up there in the imagery. So sometimes you can see things yourself, but obviously
But that's a
people
perfect example of if
pushing
you
it
had
for-
taken that picture and dropped it into Google image search, you would have seen that previous
But I think
For an agenda.
even more basic is when you see an image like that is, where am I seeing this image?
Right.
Am I seeing this image on social media? That should be an immediate red flag.
off.
There's a
Yeah.
difference between, say, seeing an image in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, because usually there's a byline, there's a photo credit, so they're saying this is the source of the information. If you just see something on Facebook or on Twitter that's being retweeted or reposted, you don't know where that image has come from. And if there's no credit or no source, then that's a great indication.
And why is the White House's social media director putting out stuff? Like the Miami airport photo with the flooding, it was actually Miami Airport that tweeted back to him and said, no,
Right.
White House, this is not
not us."
Miami Airport,
That's right.
and then they thanked the White House for correcting themselves.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I wonder to some extent whether this is a cultural problem that we have, and I think it's partly caused by the popularity of Instagram and Snapchat filters, and every picture has to be better and more exciting. And now everybody's a photographer, not just professional photographers, anybody with their iPhone is a photographer. And the use of filters makes me think that people have come to expect something more exciting and more amazing from a photograph, and that it's pushing even professional photographers to try to, the Instagramification of photojournalism, which I really worry about. And I'm thinking of a National Geographic photographer who was a Pulitzer Prize winner, who recently had a picture on his own Instagram feed that was of Eclipse Day, and it was a composite, using an image over the Grand Tetons, and it was completely out of scale. It was not correct. You probably know the picture I'm talking about. And National Geographic shared it on their Instagram feed. They did have it captioned. It was also on their website, and they did caption saying it's a photo illustration. But people don't read captions, as I'm sure you know, and people went crazy. Some people were like, oh my God, look at this amazing picture. And then photojournalists were saying, that's not a picture, that's an illustration. So do you think that some of this problem is really on journalism to not succumb to the pressure to, put filters on everything? There it is, that was the picture, yes.
Yeah. But anyone can look at that and tell it's a composite, right? Because we only have one sun and one moon.
But sometimes that image will be stripped out and the text won't be there, and people will just share that, they'll copy and paste it. And that's part of that decontextualization, which is so dangerous, that you can take you can have an image or photo illustration which is explained, and then someone simply copies and pastes and puts it on Twitter and provides a new context or a new explanation which changes the meaning.
And the wrinkle about social media is that you see things without any context. And this goes back to that stream of commerce in journalism. So when you pick up your newspaper or even watch something on television, you are watching something that has gone through a process. There was the journalist that captured it. There was probably an editor or a producer or somebody who said, okay, this is part of this story, and they put it there. And as you said, it's got bylines and credits, and people have taken ownership of it. And then it's fit into the context of a story. And then it's got the publication who has endorsed this story as, this is our version of the truth. But when you have an Instagram photograph, it sits there with no context, and then it's repurposed and recirculated with even less context.
And once it's shared by National Geographic, given the number of followers that platform has, again, even though there was a caption from the photographer saying it was an illustration, it got something like 2 million likes. And I know that threw the photojournalism world into a frenzy, that some kind of a photo illustration could get 2,000 likes when the purpose is not to be an art shop, but to be photojournalism. All right, Kendra, I want to open it up to the floor, but I also want to ask you to take what you told us about, it sounds very technical, but psychodynamic theory. You were talking about how, and some of it is the emotions that we have that make us want to believe a certain way. When, I don't know if you were here, but we were speaking earlier on the political panel, on the elections panel, about how people can see a fact check and be convinced that actually that information that they believe to be true is not true, but the studies show that it doesn't actually change the way they behave. It doesn't change their vote. They could say, oh, okay, Donald Trump is wrong about that, but I'm going to vote for him anyway. So how does the theories that you're talking about feed into our propensity to believe fake news even if we know it's fake?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I wish I could answer that one in definitive terms. I know the first time I really encountered this was just with my own family. I have a sister-in-law who during the election, we were debating some of the issues that were going on, and she had bought into a number of the fake news stories. And she's a pharmacist, so she has, the equivalent of a PhD in pharmacy. And I realized when we were talking that she was just not interested in what I was saying about the facts and providing the evidence from a scholarly perspective. And she said, it really doesn't matter. I'm going to vote the way I'm going to vote. And that's when I remembered back to the psychodynamic theories that would say that by the time that you reach a certain age, it's harder to change those opinions.
What is that age?
Well, that depends on what theory you believe in, but arguably, probably around adulthood. Yeah, so they start to get set when you're, if you look at child development.
So our college students here are our last hope.
Yeah, pretty much, guys. So, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it depends on how, the age that they are, how you develop the materials that would help them do that. I'm sure Damaso would have a lot of things to talk about. You talked about how to deal with adults and how difficult that is by comparison with children. So that's why it's so important to get with children. But certainly, I think there's something else that we haven't really brought up, and you guys may have already talked about it, but it's accountability and anonymity. I know when we teach online education, the students who take our online courses are much more engaged, much more demanding, much more verbal and outgoing in terms of both what they want to know, how they get it. They want us to answer a lot quicker than they did in face-to-face courses. That's been my experience over time. We did a study once that showed that if you have an interpersonal relationship with your students in an online environment, they're going to do better in the course. And that doesn't mean answering questions about the syllabus. It's getting to know the names of their dogs, their children. You know, I can't tell you how many students I've met at graduation that I never got to know I only got to know online, who come up and hug me at the end of the semester because they feel like we know each other, and I've never seen them before. But that makes a difference. That interpersonal relationship is probably one of the key elements, but that when we're online talking about these things, people feel like the filters are off. You know, I read the comments on news stories or just any kind of story, in the bottom, and I'm just horrified by the way people treat each other sometimes in those things, because it's got that anonymous feel to it. And that also that lack of accountability. Where is the lack of accountability? where's the accountability in that? Somebody else talking to them?
I think that's an excellent point. Connie and I were talking about that in the hallway in between sessions, and the bile that gets thrown at you in comment sections as a columnist. And I was going to say that you never got a letter. No one would ever write you a letter and mail it to you that says the same kind of stuff that people will say to you online. At least that's my experience. Yeah, the ones that are cut out in the ransom letters or written from prison with the left hand or something. I used to get those. All right, I want to open it up to all of you. I'm sure you have questions. Please do me the favor of just identifying yourself, telling us who you are and what organization you represent so we know where you're coming from. There's a gentleman there who just took his glasses off in the middle with his hand up.
Hi, Andrew Meyer. I'm the news director at WKSU. When it comes to ownership of photos, I'm curious to hear what the panel thinks of the use of photos from sites like Creative Commons.
I'll let you start.
So in my other life as an attorney, I will tell you that the problem with Creative Commons and other places that offer free photographs is that you don't actually know that the person offering them really owns them or owns the rights. And so I would much prefer that a news organization has a relationship with either an agency or a photographer and gets their work that way. I have certainly, you can find any number of free photography websites out there that claim to be offering all these pictures, and you can use them. Sure, go ahead, use them. It's not their butt on the line, and copyright is a strict liability tort, which means that even if you thought you had right to use a picture, if you didn't, you're out of luck. The level of, the punishment might be different. The damages at the end of the day might be much less if it was sort of what they call an innocent infringement. But nevertheless, you're responsible for making sure that you have the right to use that. And if you've ever heard the AFP case where a photographer named Daniel Morel tweeted out, this was after the Haiti earthquake, he tweeted out some pictures. It was the only way he could get them out. Well, somebody else stole them and retweeted, and then the person who had stolen them and retweeted gave permission to various news agencies to use the pictures, and they used them, and they were in a rather lengthy and expensive copyright lawsuit, and there were a lot of other complicated details to it. But the bottom line is that, if you don't know who's telling you, here, have a free picture, you don't actually even know that that person has a right to license the work to you.
You get what you pay for.
You also don't know the provenance of the photograph, like whether or not the person took it. And I think something that we don't talk enough about is by using free photographs, you're undermining the ecosystem of photography. If there are places that folks on Instagram won't go, especially if you look at conflict photography, if you look at underreported issues. There are long-term documentary photography, which is what I do. You can't, someone with a cell phone camera doesn't do that kind of work, but if the photojournalists can't sell their photographs because the news director or the publisher is constantly going to Creative Commons or constantly using open sourced photographs, then that person can't eat, that person can't develop themselves as a journalist. And so we lose capacity as journalists if we don't support that news ecosystem.
And it's not true just of photographs, but of writing. More and more news websites are demanding or, are either paying incredibly paltry sums for freelance writing or wanting to not pay at all, wanting to get it for free, and there are people willing to provide it for free, but that completely undermines the news and information ecosystem. Yes, we have someone right there who wants to speak. Could you identify yourself, please?
Oh, I'm Suzanne. I'm a faculty member here in the journalism school, and I also have an extensive photography background. The other issue I have with Creative Commons is you have no idea who took the photo, whether they're trustworthy, if it accurately represents the scene the photographer witnessed. They may not have anything close to what we call our journalistic values. So I have a really difficult time trusting pictures that are on Creative Commons unless they're illustrative in some non-realistic way. So I steer clear of it completely for journalism.
That's a really good point. You have to remember that journalists are trained to act as journalists, and the way they shoot, the way they choose, maybe they've gotten on 200 pictures from a scene, but which one did they decide was the important one? Which one did they decide represents the scene? All of those things those are things you pay for when you pay for good journalism, and they're things that you lose when you're not willing to pay, when you just take whatever you can get for free.
Great point. Okay.
I want to take this journalism picture copyright thing a little bit step
Can you
further.
tell us who you are, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Kay. I'm a first-year grad here at Kent in journalism broadcast. Do you have a system or a process where you take a picture as a journalist and it has all of your ebb in it, and you send it to a copyright, like a playwright would or an author would the government, and it's copyrighted and it's yours, and they have to come for permission and they have to pay for it?
Images are, you're a lawyer, but images are copyrighted the moment you create them. Now, you can register them with the government in the Copyright Office and get an additional layer of security, especially if you, not security, but an additional layer of sort of recompense if your copyright is violated. But oftentimes, I know this has happened with me, people are taking my photos from my website. It's not like they don't know who I am and what they're doing or how to contact me. And my metadata is embedded, and they often strip it out. So this is often we're seeing very willful, deliberate acts of reappropriation or manipulation, whether it be by someone trying to create a viral meme. We've seen that quite often, or a news organization or a media organization which just essentially wants to get free content.
So when that does happen to you, you have no legal verse, you have no litigation, you have no way to say, hey, wait a minute.
No, you absolutely do.
That's my photo.
If you publish someone's image that's copyrighted, the person who owns that copyright can and I think should, take action against you.
Okay.
How do you prove that you own the copyright?
Well, you can, there are a couple ways. One is you can obviously register it with the government, but second, if you can prove you created the image, right? If I have a bank of images and I can say, well, here's the sequence of images I took, it's essentially, it's sort of incumbent upon the person who published it to prove that they had the right to publish it, not necessarily you, but I think you can speak more eloquently to this.
Yeah, well, if you register, I don't want us to get too much off topic, but if you register your work, that's sort of considered prima facie proof of ownership of the copyright, and then you can get into a fight, probably will, about, various details, but actually questioning whether somebody has taken the photo is not the conflict that I usually see in copyright lawsuits. It's usually other details. So.
I think there were a couple questions over here.
I'm Brianna Horn. I'm a sophomore public relations major. I have a two-part question. There seems to be a lot of negative opinions surrounding social media, and I'm pretty sure all three of you discussed early intervention. How do you feel if teachers could include social media in the discussion/curriculum instead of ignoring it? Could this aid in fake news recognition early on? And how do we extend this into teaching adults and parents about recognition?
Is social media not being taught in journalism schools? Is that
Not in
true?
journalism school. I mean in like early intervention, kindergarten through 12.
You mean in schools?
Yes.
In primary education?
Well, I actually see a lot of, there was an article in the New York Times about sort of very innovative elementary school teacher and talk about sort of grade school teachers who create Twitter handles for their classrooms. I think that, as teachers and adults begin to use social media, you see them using it more and more within the context of the classroom. Again, I think that all this stuff is so new, relatively speaking, that people are trying to find ways to responsibly integrate it into their curriculum and into what they're teaching their students. Oftentimes, the students have vastly more experience with some of these tools, especially the new ones like Keek and Snapchat, than the teachers do. So the teachers and the curriculum designers are playing catch up and like, well, okay, so how do I incorporate Snapchat into my history lesson? There are ways to do it, but if you don't have a Snapchat account or you don't have a handle on the technology, then it becomes very challenging. But I do think that we have to, educators have to begin to engage with social media both as a teaching tool, but also how to teach responsible use of social media and teach students how to be responsible creators of social media content. And this is something that we're just starting, I think, in the education system.
Can I add to that? Yes.
I think you're touching on a really important question, and I think it's something that brings all of us together, and that is just the notion of literacies in general, whether it's news literacy, information literacy, financial literacy, whatever. I know that I've worked in several programs where we've had young literacy programs for children. So, for example, we had a program at South Carolina for teaching young children about budgeting, like 5 and 6-year-olds. Here's your allowance. This is how it's made up. These are the things you can do with it. And concurrently, at the same time, that we had those financial literacy programs for their parents. So while the kids were learning budget stuff in one room, the parents were learning financial literacy on their own in another room. And so just the whole notion of literacies and how we can work concurrently, all of us together. I mean, information science is certainly focused on literacy and has been for a long time in terms of reading and writing, but literacies covers everything. Health literacy, science literacy, right? So I think that's a really, really important question.
There are also, not only does the News Literacy Project have fantastic resources online, we at Poynter have a lot of resources online, both about news literacy and about social media use, and most of them are free. Some of them are courses that have a cost associated, but most of them are free, so you can find those on our site as well. Yes?
Thank you. Thinking maybe not too far in the future, but have you any indication, especially at Poynter, on augmented reality and virtual reality, AI? There was a video recently that was artificial intelligence in taking and creating a video that could lip sync appropriately, and it was Obama, and it showed the real video and the fake one. And I keep going back to Wag the Dog, which is like a 20-year-old movie, if any of you saw it, but this is happening now. How in the world are we going to know the truth? I mean, does anybody doing anything to kind of look way ahead there?
Well, I can partly answer that because I just got a message in my email box today from someone on the strategy side at the Associated Press who told me that they talked to me and many people throughout the industry on that very question about augmented reality, virtual reality, et cetera, and they're trying to set up basically ethics standards that the industry could live by, and they're going to be coming out with their report next week. So keep your eyes open for an AP report on that. But there are a lot of people looking at this, and the guy who was the head of visual journalism at the AP, who worked a lot on AR and VR, is now the head of visual journalism at NBC.com. So he is doing, I mean, there are just a lot of people thinking about this, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the ethical issues that come up with, for example, drone journalism is another one that's complicated because there's so many privacy issues. I imagine it's something you talk about a lot in your work, but I'd love to hear from you. Have you worked on AR and VR as well?
Not AR and VR, but definitely we're working on training people in drone journalism. But photography is a perfect sort of microcosm of this thing, which is that photography has changed, every few years. Photography technology changes, whether it was suddenly we were using color film, and then suddenly we were scanning, and then suddenly we were using digital cameras, and now we're taking flight and online and all this stuff. About 10 years ago, I think, maybe a little more, the NPPA completely redid our code of ethics, and it was designed to be timely and something that would change with the times. And really, I approached the law in a very similar way, which is that the technology changes, the tools change, but the fundamentals don't change. And so you can look at our code of ethics and say, the things that were designed to apply to your straight up basic, photographer with a film camera, they apply if you're flying a drone. You can't invade someone's privacy. You can't do that with a regular camera. You can't do that with heat-seeking technology, and you can't do it with a drone. And so I think that we have to think of ethics in a sort of standard way that crosses all kinds of technology, and it's just a tool. The rules, I don't think, really change that much.
But the context changes so much.
Yeah.
And one thing people don't realize when you talk about invading privacy and the whole question of photojournalism, I think some people just don't realize that, like, a public street, that's fair game.
Right.
Yeah, you can't invade someone's privacy by breaking into their house or hopping their fence into their backyard and taking a picture, but if a celebrity is walking down the street,
Or an
you
ordinary
can take,
person is
that's what I
walking
mean,
down.
anybody.
That's not an invasion
you
of
can
privacy,
take, that's not invading their
absolutely.
privacy. You can take a picture. So the same thing I think applies to drone journalism.
Yes.
You can't fly a drone over someone's backyard and take a picture of them in their house, but you can fly a drone and take a picture of them on the street.
Absolutely.
So, that's something to think about too. Like, we have different
Absolutely.
ideas of privacy when it applies to us, when we're the one in the crosshairs. I think that we need to wrap that up and give you a chance to take a bathroom break and a telephone break before the next session. And please join me in thanking our panelists for such thought-provoking comments.